So I think it's interesting looking at these signs that there are, and this is far from comprehensive what we've done here. We've done some in the past. There's a smattering of things here. Keeping that in mind, that there are just so many signals that we're in for a big popping of the bubble and a crash. I found this article, which it just makes you wonder sometimes. This is from February 28 by Alex Lawson in The Guardian. Millennials are on course to become the, quote, richest generation in history. The generational transfer of wealth, largely built up in property, will amount to $90 trillion in the U.S. alone, a report says. Is this really the case? Well, let's read a bit and then I have some thoughts. Millennials may have been portrayed as frivolous spenders, squandering their income on overpriced coffees and online classes in the face of pitiful long-term finances. Yeah, none of that was true. Okay, that's just called blaming the victim. That's punching down. That's all that is. You know, avocado toast is not why you can't afford a house. It's not why you can't afford college. It's not why you can't afford medical care, and so on. But millennials are on course to become the, quote, richest generation in history, a study has shown. Those born between 1981 and 2000 are in line for a, quote, seismic windfall over the next 20 years, according to research by real estate agent Knight Frank, thanks to the property assets accumulated by the generations before them. Now, here's the basic question before we go any further with this. Is that wealth going to actually stay in millennials' pockets, or is it going to get eaten up by rising cost? Okay, so first of all, bold of you to assume that that value is actually going to get passed down to the next generation, inherited, bequeathed to the next generation. With the way that medical care works in the United States, people in the last decade of their life tend to rack up enormous medical expenses, which may or may not be covered by insurance. So how do you pay for that? Well, most of the value that people have is like equity that they have in a house or something like that. So you have to sell that. So if you're selling that, and then or even just taking out like a loan based on that, that's not something that you can transfer to the next generation in an inheritance, right? So then beyond that, to whatever doesn't get eaten up and actually does get transferred, handed down to the kids, are the kids going to be able to just kind of pocket that and then be affluent? I mean, to a certain extent, a little bit, but you look at student debt, you look at just rising costs in general, as I was just saying, like credit card spending going up because people are super squeezed right now. Trying to do anything is just incredibly expensive, like anything, including just living, incredibly expensive. So how much of this is just going to get spent? That's really what's being overlooked. Anyway, I'll leave that there. Let's move on to the next article, which I think says more about this. First of all, this is something that we did recently from CBS News. More young adults are living at home across the U.S. Here's why. This is from September, so just a few months ago. And it says more than 60% of Gen Zers and millennials reported moving back home in the past 2 years, often because of financial challenges. So that's kind of how millennials are doing right now. Anyway, you got to live with mom and dad because you can't afford to live on your own. It's too expensive. I'm a little bit older. I was fortunate enough to be able to get some independence and like live out on my own. A lot of people just don't have that option, and so your roommates are your parents. But going beyond that, here's another story. This is from March 12. Nearly 50% of U.S. parents are financially supporting their adult children, a study finds. The soaring costs of food and housing are forcing many still to rely on parents to cover expenses as they risk retirement security. Nearly half of U.S. parents provide some kind of financial support to their adult children who are grappling with higher food and living costs than they did, a new study has found. So again, is this money just going to get spent? That would be my guess. Continuing, the study was conducted by Savings.com, and it found that young working class Americans were not substantially benefiting from the, quote, recovery of the country's economy, as evidenced by high employment, falling inflation, and economic growth. That has forced many of them to continue to rely on their parents to help cover costs of living. The average age of adults receiving financial help from their parents, sometimes at the risk of the parents' retirement security, was 22, according to the study. And while parents surveyed in the study on average said that their adult children should become financially independent by 25, that's making some assumptions about where things are going to end up, can they get jobs, etc. Many were supporting those children beyond that milestone. Of parents providing support, 21% were helping millennials, aged 28 to 43, or members of Gen X, 44 to 59. Millennials and Gen X adult children were, on average, given between $907 and $960 each month by their parents. Gen Z adults, between 18 and 27, were getting more help from their mothers and fathers, averaging about $1,500 monthly. Notably, many adults from Gen Z still have college and university expenses, and I may add, will have those expenses for quite some time to come. Again, another failed promise of Joe Biden. They were going to do the college loan forgiveness. It got blocked, and it's not a political priority. Instead, funding Israel's genocide, that's the priority. And again, this ties back into the needs of not just the Democratic Party or their political weaknesses, or not just the Republican Party. It's the needs of capitalism at a system. It's the needs of capitalism as a system at this point, which needs to put the cost of everything increasingly on workers. As the rate of profit falls, as it's harder for them to scrounge up those tasty profits, well, how do they deal with the shortfall? It's by pushing costs onto workers, externalizing more and more costs onto society. The most common expenses that parents covered for adults across those three generations were groceries, food, cell phone bills, which is required basically to live in this society, rent, mortgages, tuition, and health insurance. With soaring costs of food, housing, and other living expenses, more adults are either choosing or being forced to still live in their parents' home, the survey determined, and the future outlook of the cost to live in the U.S. remains bleak. Again, I believe that we're going to see a big crash coming in the next few years, but what's likely to happen is it's going to go right back up after that. So you get this brief window of relief, after which it'll just go back up, just like we saw, if we go back to the 130-year chart of inflation-adjusted housing prices. What you don't see is a stable line. Like, look there between, the post-war period, 1945 to like 1980. You got pretty much stable prices, inflation adjusted. They even went down a little bit over time. Then there's a peak in 1980, the beginning of the neoliberal period, and then another peak in 1990, which is a pretty significant rise and fall, and a pretty sudden and significant rise and fall. And then after that, we go into neoliberalism 2.0, the war on terror years. In the 2000s, gigantic housing spike and then crash. And now again, the exact same thing. It's the opposite of stability. It is not pure chaos, but it is just huge rises and huge falls. And you just don't, it's constantly moving. It's not stable. It's not steady. And I will add, one of the things that socialism really strives for is price stability. And what we're looking at is the exact opposite of price stability in this case. So moving on with the article, all food prices are predicted to increase by nearly 3%, according to the U.S. Agriculture Department. Supermarket and grocery store purchases are expected to increase by 1.6%. Affordable housing, meanwhile, remains in short supply. That's putting it mildly. The levels of housing inventory for sale, then there's rent, but for sale is at like 40% of pre-pandemic levels. It's starting to catch up in certain regions, particularly the Southeast, but there's still quite a way to go, and probably investors won't cough up those properties and put them back on the market until things get a lot tighter, at which point you'll probably see a gigantic slide. It'll happen all at once as people try to beat, they try to sell theirs before the prices tank, But then everybody will get the same message basically all at the same time. Until then, they're all holding out. Remember, it is a big con game in the end. So anyway, if an adult in the U.S. is even able to buy a house, record high interest rates can deter them from taking out a mortgage or home loan. In October 2023, the average interest rate for a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage was nearly 8%, a more than 20-year high, according to the Mortgage Bankers Association. By the way, side note, the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, or just 30-year mortgage in general, has become a standard, but it wasn't always the standard. It used to be 20 years, and actually if you're buying like commercially, it's shorter, like 5, 10, or 20. But it became a 30-year mortgage because, first, they can bleed you for longer, and people couldn't afford it as much. If you look up, they've started to float 40-year mortgages. So, like, if you buy that at the age of 40, you'll never own it until you're 80. So you'll just be paying. The bank will own it until you're 80 years old. Continuing, while interest rates have since fallen for many, they haven't fallen enough, especially since houses are also more expensive. The average age of homebuyers last year was 49, and they're only getting older. A new Harris Poll Thought Leadership and Future Practice survey of U.S. renters from all age groups, Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, and Boomers, reported 61% said that they were worried they would never be able to own a house, with some saying that the areas in which they live had become so unaffordable that they were, quote, barely livable. And this is true. The West Coast, the East Coast, and a significant section inland from those, with a few pockets of cheaper stuff. But by and large, both coasts and a significant portion inland is priced to infinity right now. There's, again, some more relief in the Southeast. Florida's starting to crack, although Florida was cranked way, way, way up. Texas is starting to drop, in part because they built a lot of new houses. The impact of that hasn't even been fully felt yet. But then a lot of that, quote, flyover country, like states that aren't necessarily the most desirable north of Texas, those are cheaper and falling. But, it varies by zip code too. Anyway, yes, large swaths of 4 or 5, 6 states in a row are just priced to hell. And so if you want to move to get out of that, you have to move a 10-hour drive away. You have to move completely out of the region that you're in. That's how a lot of the country is right now. Younger generations also carry more student loan debt than ever and make lower wages when adjusted for inflation. But supporting their adult children could compromise parents' ability to save for their own future. So, again, putting the conclusions of that last article in doubt somewhat. Working parents were found to contribute 2.4 times more to support adult children than they do to their retirement accounts each month, according to the Savings.com study. The average amount a parent gives to their adult child each month is about $1,400, more than twice what the average working parent contributed to their own retirement savings monthly, which on average was $609. The study also said that 61% of adults living at their parents' homes don't pay rent or contribute to any household expenses. The study concluded that, quote, there is a clear challenge in the economy today, you think, driven by a convoluted mix of socioeconomic factors, not really that convoluted. Adults receive help from their parents well into their 20s, 30s, and beyond, the study said. For some, it's tempting to simply say that, this makes me so mad. For some, it's tempting to simply say that today's young adults are just mooches and that a strong foot in the rear will launch them into normal, independent adulthood. Now, what you're considering normal is the product of a previous stage of the class system. That was normal for boomers because that's where capitalism was at that point. And it's just delusional. It's a denial of the reality in front of you to think that people can still conform to that. No, people didn't just suddenly become lazy. No, boomers are not some paragons of work ethic and virtue and all of that. This is due to structural factors in the economy. Thinking that way may be gratifying for parents who are tired of footing the bill and who, don't want to grapple with the realities that they just sucked up to capitalism and this is where it got them and their children. But it doesn't solve or even properly describe the economic factors at play. such as rising housing costs. And again, we looked at those bubbles twice. What's driving that? A lot of what is driving this bubble activity that, again, this is my favorite image in the world right now. What is driving these huge spikes? A lot of it is small to mid level investor activity. There is, we've discussed previously, some Democrats came out with a bill to ban hedge funds getting involved in the economy. And yes, it's true that some very large capital firms have gotten involved in buying single family houses and duplexes and stuff like that and becoming corporate Wall Street landlords. That to some extent has happened. However, it is dwarfed by smaller and mid-level investors that are trying to get rich quick without doing any work, just buying a house, maybe doing minor renovations, and then just flipping it for a ton of money. So but when your way of, quote, earning a living, really just scamming people, is hoarding housing, a basic necessity, no, you're fucking scum. And a socialist United States, or whatever it would become at that point, if not the United States, a socialist country would not be allowing this kind of activity. Housing would be a right, and all of the decrepit, housing that is not really suitable for living in would be torn down and replaced with modern, decent housing, and so on. You would need a revolution in the housing sector, but no more of this scarcity-based housing thing and treating housing as an investment, etc. All of that would be gone in socialism.